Hello listeners, this talk is in response to the commenter Babylonian Hebrew, and he asked me, why is it that every leftist movement seems to devour itself? So thanks for the question, and I hope my response will be adequate. Before I get into actually addressing that question, I would like to offer a couple of definitions because I think these will be useful in setting the tone or laying the groundwork for actually answering the question. I would like to define the differences between people on the right and people on the left. Now, on the right, there are essentially two positions, and these are essentially flip sides of the same coin, depending upon what is happening within society. And those two positions are conservative positions and reactionary positions. Conservatives are trying to preserve the current status quo or perhaps undo some changes that have occurred fairly recently. But they don't want to completely overhaul society. They generally don't like big moves. They like change to be organic and incremental, if it is to occur at all. They're not opposed to change, but they like change to be incremental. Now, conservatives are by definition winning because they're able to actually be effective. They're able to conserve something. By this definition, there are very few, if any, conservatives currently in the West. People may think that they're conservative, either the politicians themselves or their supporters may think that they're conservative, and yet if you zoom out from the particular moment in time and you look at where things were a year before or 2 years before or 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 years before, they're not actually really conserving anything. They're fighting what amounts to a series of retreats, basically, tactical withdrawals. That's what they're actually doing. So I don't think there are very many conservatives, if any, in the West currently. Reactionaries, on the other hand, are trying to institute revolutionary change, and they're trying to really wind the clock back a considerable period and undo a lot of changes, not just very recent changes, but changes over a much broader period of time. And by definition, they're losing because they're not able to do that. And they're the flip side of conservatives in that regard. And that's why I think that most people nowadays, if they're truly on the right, they're actually reactionary because they're the rear guard. They're fighting a rear guard action against progressives and losing that, essentially. And really anyone these days who is on the right, who isn't a conservative, is reactionary. Now, there are some basic assumptions that people on the right have. Their metaphysical view is very different from people on the left. In one way or another, they believe that man is fallen or irrational or has incomplete knowledge and power within the universe and cannot attain complete knowledge or power. They feel as though they're part of something that's much bigger than them. And there are lots of variations on that idea, but essentially that's the idea that people on the right have to one degree or another. People on the left, however, believe that at some level, man is the center of the universe. Man can know everything and will eventually get there, given enough time. He will eventually know everything. He will be able to enact change in a similar manner. He will be able to think about how the world should be, how he would like it to be, and eventually get it to that point. So they're very different to people on the right in that regard. And there are lots of labels that people on the left have, but progressive is probably a very good one because they think that they're going to progress towards some sort of end point. And that's everything that their politics is about. So the fundamental difference then is that people on the right are essentially concerned with what is. They live in a world of is. People on the left are concerned with how they think things should be or how they ought to be. So they live in a world of ought, not is. And because of that, the fundamental ordering of politics is different for these two, and the way they perceive of politics is different for these two positions. People on the right can actually, ironically, reach an endpoint because they can say, all right, I will never know everything, I will never have full power, therefore I can defer to something outside of myself, whether that's a god, whether that's human nature and Darwinianism and all of this sort of stuff. Regardless, they can defer to something outside of themselves and say, okay, I have to work within that framework. And so they can actually be satisfied with that. Whereas people on the left cannot do that. They can never reach a point of satisfaction because they have a utopian ideal, something that they think towards which they think they can work. And of course they can't. And so they're always frustrated in the attempts to reach that end point, and so they never can, and therefore they can never be satisfied with that. They can never reach a point of stability. People on the left or leftist movements are essentially like sharks. They cannot stop swimming. They must continue to swim, and of course they swim towards the left. Even if they think, well, I just want to move 1 or 2 steps to the left, I don't want to go full on crazy, I just want to move 1 or 2 steps to the left. In so doing, of course, they become conservatives. By definition, they'll get to that point and then they'll say, right, that's enough, and we'll just stop here. And then they become conservatives because they don't want to keep going leftwards. But generally speaking, the left will continue to go leftwards. And one of the fundamental points about the left is that status is attained or gained on the left by progressing, and whoever is progressing currently or whoever is progressing the most has the most status, and they can always wield that over other people they consider to not be as left as them. They can wield that over them and say, well, I'm holier than you are because I'm progressing. You're not progressing, or you're not progressing enough, or not quickly enough, and so on and so forth. And so they always define things in relative terms, in terms of where everyone is in a sort of a pecking order, who is to the right or the left of them. And essentially, the bad guys are those who are farthest to the right of them. And one of the interesting things about this is why someone who may have been considered progressive or left-wing several decades ago, say imagine a baby boomer who is now in his 60s, who was around in the late 60s or early 70s as a young person, and he thought he was on the left then. And he adopted those positions in his youth, and he hasn't changed them since. That person can actually find himself under attack from people to the left of him, and he'll sort of be scratching his head saying, what's going on? I'm not on the right. Why are you attacking me? I'm on the left. And they'll be saying, no, you're not. And he'll be saying, yes, I am, because he doesn't understand that status on the left is always conferred to the person who's farthest to the left. And so there's this sort of escalation, this arms race of people constantly trying to outflank each other from the left. And this person who began on the left finds himself, having been outflanked on the left, finds himself now on the right, and also under attack by people farther to the left than himself. And this is of real concern to him. And this is where I'm getting to the actual answer of why the left, or why leftist movements end up devouring themselves. Because essentially there are only 2 things that can happen. The first is that they can just keep going farther and farther to the left until everything just falls in a heap, or at some point someone can step in and they can say, right, that's it. Because in order to keep going farther and farther to the left, they need to devour everything that's to the right of them, everything that's the farthest to the right, well, beginning with everything farthest to the right. So first, they eat people on the far right, then they eat people on the centre-right, then they eat the centre, then they now find themselves in the position where there are only people on the left, but in relative terms, there's still someone who's on the right in relative terms, and so they start eating that person. And as part of this process, because their ideas get crazier and crazier and crazier, and they purge anyone who doesn't fall in line with those ideas, they essentially devour all of the functionality within a society. And so there's literally nothing left that can actually maintain society, and it all falls in a heap. Now, that may be the end of it if that society exists in isolation, but usually something will happen. Someone will step in at that point and bring the whole project to a close. And that person or group that steps in, they will essentially draw a line in the sand and say nothing to the left of this line. Now, this person or group could be one of a number of things. This person could come from a completely different society or civilization and could be an occupying force. Or, well, firstly, it could be a conquering force. This person or group could come in and just either completely eradicate that other society, the leftist society, that's sort of very dysfunctional. They could completely eradicate it. Or they could conquer it and sort of assimilate it ethnically, culturally, linguistically, and so on. And over time, that leftist society would essentially cease to function, or cease to exist. Or they could occupy and rule from afar, or occupy and try to impose some order and stability, and then when that has been imposed, withdraw. Now, this process of imposing order or stability may not be what people in that leftist society are used to, either now being on the left or even previously when they had a functional society. It may not be what they're used to. It may be completely different, completely foreign in terms of it could be religion, it could be politics, it could be all sorts of things. But because things are so out of control, they will actually welcome that change because it represents order and stability. And another thing that could happen is that there might still exist within the society some people somewhere to the right of the current batch of crazy lefties who are functional. These people could be in the middle, they could be way out on the right, but nevertheless there's somewhere to the right. Someone could emerge from within that group of people if they haven't all been purged already, and could then reimpose some sort of order, and then purge the people on the left, of course. And an example of that might be someone like Pinochet in Chile. It frequently comes from within the military because they have the ability, obviously, to overthrow the politicians. Now, there can also be change that can occur from within the left itself. There can be someone who is on the left, definitely on the left, but is not quite as crazy as those other people, or can see where things are heading and says, right, okay, and he steps in, he seizes authority, or he has a group of supporters, they step in and seize authority, and he draws a line in the sand and he purges everyone to the left of him. And to some extent he becomes conservative or reactionary. He may not talk in those terms, he may still talk about a revolution and so on, but at some level he becomes conservative or reactionary. So someone like Stalin would probably fit this description, because he was on the left, but he basically said, right, nothing really, really, really crazy out on the left. I mean, he was still pretty bad, but he didn't want full-on Trotskyite politics. So someone like that comes in, draws a line on the left, and then purges everything to the left. Now, if the society is not too far gone, it may bounce back, depending on all sorts of things. But typically what happens is that this person who is already on the left is a little bit crazy, or even very crazy. And because it takes a certain person who is willing to seize authority and then purge a whole bunch of people, if that person is already on the left, typically what happens is that the society rests upon some sort of cult of personality, and this person is a very strong figure. And because it doesn't have the sort of buttressing effect of traditional systems and institutions that have already been destroyed, and that he can't necessarily bring back, because that would be some sort of admission of fault and failure within the left. So someone on the right who seizes power can do that, because that's not seen as being out of position for him to bring back the church or bring back some other institution that represents traditionalism. That's not out of place for someone on the right. But for someone on the left who's purged those things, that reinstituting those kinds of things would be some level of admission of failure and would open him up to all sorts of problems. And so because he doesn't have these traditional systems that acted as a buttress for society, and because his power really revolves around his cult of personality and so on, the leader may become increasingly paranoid, and frequently does. And then he starts purging all sorts of other people as well, and still tries to implement all sorts of crazy ideas. And you can see where this is going, right? We get back to that decision fork. We return to that point where there's either collapse or regime change again. And there are a number of ways this regime change can happen. Sometimes it can be through an assassination or outside forces stepping in. But frequently the person involved will die in office, and then there will be a successor who will be a reformer. And so an example of this might be Deng Xiaoping in China. So basically that's the end of the talk. I hope that has been fairly informative and has helped to clarify some things. But the short answer is that the left eventually devours itself because it has nothing else to devour, and then it falls in a heap as a result of that. So I hope this has been thought-provoking. Please let me know in the comments. And if you have any particular topics you would like me to address, you can also ask me questions. I have some others that I'm still getting through, but I will try to get around to you soon enough. So thanks for listening.